Chapter 15. Vocational Guidance. But how can the Negro in this new system learn to make a living, the most important task to which all people must give attention? In view of the Negro's economic plight, most of the schools are now worked up over what is called, quote-unquote, vocational guidance, in an effort to answer this very question. To what, however, are they to guide their Negro students? Most Negroes now employed are going down blind alleys, and unfortunately, some schools seem to do no more than to stimulate their going in that direction. This may seem to be a rash statement, but a study of our educational system shows that our schools are daily teaching Negroes what they can never apply in life, or what is no longer profitable because of the revolution of industry by the multiplication of mechanical appliances. For example, some of our schools are still teaching individual garment making, which offers no future today except in catering to the privileged and rich classes. Some of these institutions still offer instruction in shoemaking, when the technique developed under their handicaps makes impossible competition with that of the modern factory based upon the invention of a Negro, Jan Matzliger. These facts have been known for generations, but some of these institutions apparently change not. Education, like religion, is conservative. It makes haste slowly only, and sometimes not at all. Do not change the present order of thinking and doing, many say, for you disturbed too many things long since regarded as ideal. The dead past, according to this view, must be the main factor in determining the future. We should learn from the living past, but let the dead past remain dead. A survey of employment of the Negroes in this country shows a most undesirable situation. The education of the masses has not enabled them to advance very far in making a living, and has not developed in the Negro the power to change this condition. It is revealed that in many establishments, the Negro, when a young man, starts as a janitor or porter, and dies in old age in the same position. Tradition fixes his status as such, and both races feel satisfied. When this janitor or porter dies, the dailies headline the passing of this Negro who knew his place and rendered satisfactory service in it. Quote-unquote, distinguished white men for whom he ran errands and cleaned cuspidors volunteer as honorary pallbearers and follow his remains to the final resting place. Thoughtless Negro editors, instead of expressing their regret that such a life of usefulness was not rewarded by promotion, take up the refrain as some great honor bestowed upon the race. Among people thus satisfied in the lower pursuits of life and sending their children to school to memorize theories which they never see applied, there can be no such thing as vocational guidance. Such an effort implies an objective, and in the present plight of economic dependence, there is no occupation for which the Negro may prepare himself with the assurance that he will find employment. Opportunities which he has today may be taken from him tomorrow, and schools, changing their curricula in hit and miss fashion, may soon find themselves on the wrong track, just as they have been for generations. Negroes do not need someone to guide them to what persons of another race have developed. They must be taught to think and develop something for themselves. It is most pathetic to see Negroes begging others for a chance, as we have been doing recently. Quote-unquote, do not force us into starvation, we said. Let us come into your stores and factories and do a part of what you are doing to profit by our trade. The Negro as a slave developed this fatal sort of dependency, and, restricted mainly to menial service and drudgery during nominal freedom, he has not grown out of it. Now the Negro is facing the ordeal of either learning to do for himself or to die out gradually in the breadline in the ghetto. If the schools really mean to take part in necessary uplift, they must first supply themselves with teachers. Unfortunately, we have very few such workers. The large majority of persons supposedly teaching Negroes never carry to the schoolroom any thought as to improving their condition. From the point of view of these so-called teachers, they have done their duty when, in automaton fashion, they impart in the schoolroom the particular facts which they wrote out in the examination when they quote-unquote qualified for their respective positions. Most of them are satisfied with receiving their pay and spending it for the toys and gewgaws of life. For example, the author is well acquainted with a Negro of this type who is now serving as the head of one of the largest schools in the United States. From the point of view of our present system, he is well educated. He holds advanced degrees from one of the leading institutions of the world, and he is known to be well informed on all the educational theories developed from the time of Socrates down to the day of Dewey. Yet this quote-unquote educator says repeatedly that in his daily operations he never has anything to do with Negroes because they are impossible. He says that he never buys anything from a Negro store, and he would not dare to put a penny in a Negro bank. From such teachers, large numbers of Negroes learn this fateful lesson. For example, not long ago a committee of Negroes in a large city went to the owner of a chain store in their neighborhood and requested that he put a Negro manager in charge. This man replied that he doubted that the Negroes themselves wanted such a thing. The Negroes, urging him to make the change, assured him that they were unanimously in favor of it. The manager, however, asked them to be fair enough with his firm and themselves to investigate before pressing the matter any further. They did so and discovered that 137 Negro families in that neighborhood seriously objected to buying from Negroes and using articles handled by them. These Negroes then had to do the groundwork of uprooting the inferiority idea which had resulted from their miseducation. To what then can a Negro, while despising the enterprise of his fellows, guide the youth of his race, and where do you figure out that the youth thus guided will be by 1950? The whites are daily informing Negroes that they need not come to them for opportunities. Can the Negro youth, miseducated by persons who depreciate their efforts, learn to make opportunities for themselves? This is the real problem which the Negroes must solve, and he who is not interested in it and makes no effort to solve it is worthless in the present struggle. Our advanced teachers, like quote unquote most highly educated Negroes, pay little attention to the things about them except when the shoe begins to pinch on one or the other side. Unless they happen to become naked, they never think of the production of cotton or wool. Unless they get hungry, they never give any thought to the output of wheat or corn. Unless their friends lose their jobs, they never inquire about the outlook for coal or steel, or how these things affect the children whom they are trying to teach. In other words, they live in a world, but they are not of it. How can such persons guide the youth without knowing how these things affect the Negro community? The Negro community, in a sense, is composed of those around you, but it functions in a different way. You cannot see it by merely looking out of the windows of the schoolroom. This community requires scientific investigation. While persons of African blood are compelled to sustain closer relation to their own people than to other elements in society, they are otherwise influenced socially and economically. The Negro community suffers for lack of delimitation because of the various ramifications of life in the United States. For example, there may be a Negro grocer in the neighborhood, but the Negro chauffeur for a rich man downtown and the washerwoman for an aristocratic family in quote-unquote quality row will be more than apt to buy their food and clothing at the larger establishment with which their employers have connections, although they may be insulted there. Negroes of the District of Columbia have millions of dollars deposited in banks downtown, where Negro women are not allowed in the ladies' restrooms. Right in the heart of the highly educated Negro section of Washington, too, is a restaurant catering through the front door exclusively to the white businessmen, who must live in the Negro section to supply them with the necessities of life, and catering at the same time through the back door to numbers of Negroes who pile into that dingy room to purchase whatever may be thrown at them. Yet less than 2 blocks away are several Negroes running cafes where they can be served for the same amount and under desirable circumstances. Negroes who do this, we say, do not have the proper attitude toward life and its problems, and for that reason we do not take up time with them. They do not belong to our community. The traducers of the race, however, are guiding these people the wrong way. Why do not the quote-unquote educated Negroes change their course by identifying themselves with the masses? For similar reasons, the Negro professional may not always have a beautiful home and a fine car. His plight, to the contrary, may result from action like that of a poor man who recently knocked on the author's door about midnight to use his telephone to call the ambulance of the casualty hospital to take immediate charge of his sick wife. Although living nearer to the Freedmen's Hospital, where more sympathetic consideration would have been given this patient, he preferred to take her to the other hospital, where she would have to be carried through the backyard and placed in a room over a stable. He worked there, however, and because of long association with his traducers and the sort of treatment that they have meted out to him, he was willing to entrust to their hands the very delicate matter of the health of his wife. This was a part of his community. Large numbers of Negroes live in such a community. You say that such an atmosphere is not congenial, and you will not lose time with these people who are thus satisfied. But the exploiting preacher, the unprincipled politician, the notorious gambler, and the agent of vice are all there purposely misleading these people who have not as yet shaken from their minds the shackles of slavery. What is going to become of them? What is going to become of you? We avoid them because we find enjoyment among others, but they are developing their own community. Their teacher lives in another community which may or may not be growing. Will his community so expand as to include theirs? If not, their community may encroach upon his. It is a sort of social dualism. What will the end be? The teacher will help to answer this question. Such guidance, however, must not be restricted to the so-called common people. So many Negroes now engaged in business have no knowledge of its possibilities and limitations. Most of them are as unwise as a Negro businessman who came to Washington recently in a $10,000 car representing a firm with only $100,000 invested. It is only a matter of time before his firm will be no more. He started out destroying his business at the very source. While Negroes are thus spending their means and themselves in riotous living, the foreigners come to dwell among them in modest circumstances, long enough to get rich, and to join those who close in on these unfortunates economically until all the hopes for their redemption are lost. If the Negroes of this country are to escape starvation and rise out of poverty unto comfort and ease, they must change their way of thinking and living. Never did the author see a more striking demonstration of such a necessity than recently when a young man came to him looking for a job. He was well bedecked with jewelry and fine clothes, and while he was in the office he smoked almost enough cigars to pay one's board for that day. A man of this type in a poverty-stricken group must suffer and die. A young woman recently displaced in a position from which she received considerable income for a number of years approached the author not long ago to help her solve the problem of making a living. He could not feel very sympathetic toward her, however, for she had on a coat which cost enough to maintain one comfortably for at least 2 years. While talking with him, moreover, she was so busy telling him about what she wanted that she had little time to inform him as to what she can do to supply her needs. A man whom the author knows is decidedly handicapped by having lost a lucrative position. He must now work for a little more than half of what he has been accustomed to earning. With his former stipend, he was able to maintain 2 or 3 girls in addition to his wife, and he drank the best of bootleg stuff available. And now, trying to do all of these things on a small wage, he finds himself following a most tortuous course to make his ends meet, and he suffers within as well as without. This undesirable attitude toward life results from the fact that the Negro has learned from others how to spend money much more rapidly than he has learned how to earn it. During these days, therefore, it will be very wise for Negroes to concentrate on the wise use of money and the evil results from the misuse of it. In large cities like Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, they earn millions and millions every year and throw these vast sums immediately away for trifles which undermine their health, vitiate their morals, and contribute to the undoing of generations of Negroes unborn. This enlightenment as to economic possibilities in the Negro community must not only include instruction as to how enterprises can be made possible, but how they should be apportioned among the various parts of the Negro community. Such knowledge is especially necessary in the case of Negroes because of the fatal tendency toward imitation, not only of the white man, but the imitation of others in his own group. For example, a Negro starts a restaurant on a corner and does well. Another Negro, observing this prosperity, thinks that he can do just as well by opening a similar establishment next door. The inevitable result is that by dividing the trade between himself and his forerunner, he makes it impossible for either one to secure sufficient patronage to continue in business. In undertakings of great importance, this same undesirable tendency toward duplication of effort is also apparent. It has been a common thing to find 2 or 3 banks in the Negro community, each one struggling for an existence and competing for the patronage of the small group of people, all of whom would hardly be able to support one such financial institution. These banks continue their unprofitable competition and never think of merging until some crisis forces them to the point that they have to do so or go into bankruptcy. The Negro community then never has a strong financial institution with sufficient resources to stimulate the efforts of the businessmen who otherwise might succeed. The same short-sightedness has been evident in the case of the insurance companies organized by Negroes. One was established here and then another followed there in imitation of the first. We have been accustomed to boast that the Negroes have about 50 insurance companies in this country, marking the corners of the streets of the cities with large signs displaying what they are doing for the race. Instead of boasting of such unwise expansion, we should have received such information with sorrow, for what the race actually needs is to merge all of the insurance companies now supported by Negroes and make one good one. Such a step away from duplication would be a long stride toward our much needed awakening, and it would certainly give us prestige in the business world. This imitation and duplication are decidedly disastrous to economic enterprise, as we can daily observe. A few days ago, a young man in the East lamented the fact that after investing his life's earnings in the drug business and making every effort to stimulate the enterprise, he has failed. Someone took occasion thereupon to remind him that men have grown rich, as a rule, not by doing what thousands of others are doing, but by undertaking something new. If instead of going into the retail dispensing of drugs, he had conceived and carried out the idea of the chain drugstore, he would have become an independently rich man. There is always a chance to do this because the large majority of people do not think, and therefore leave the field wide open for those who have something new with which to please the public. Negroes even found this possible during the days of slavery, when the race supposedly had no chance at all. About 100 years ago, Thomas Day, a North Carolina Negro, realized that the rough furniture of the people in his community did not meet the requirements of those of modern tastes. He therefore worked out a style of ornate and beautiful furniture, which attracted the attention of the most aristocratic people of the state, and built up for himself a most successful business. Persons in that state are still talking about the Day furniture, and not long ago it became the subject of a magazine article. If North Carolina would turn out more Negroes of this type today, instead of the rather large number who are going to teach and preach, some of its present economic problems might thereby be solved. During these same years, another Negro was showing himself to be equally ingenious. This was Henry Boyd. After buying himself in Kentucky, he went to Cincinnati to start life as a free man. There he encountered so much prejudice against Negro labor that he could not find employment at his trade of cabinet making. A new thought came to him, however, and in this way he solved his own problem. Boyd became convinced that people had been sleeping long enough on straw ticks and wooden slats, and he invented the corded bed, the most comfortable bed prior to the use of springs, which brought still more ease. Boyd's corded bed became popular throughout the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, and he built up a profitable trade which required the employment of 25 white and black artisans. Other enterprising Negro businessmen like Boyd gave the Negro element of Cincinnati more of an aspect of progress before the Civil War than it has today. Has the Negro less chance today than he had a century ago? For about 30 years, the author knew an old Negro lady at Gordonsville, Virginia, who gave the world something new in frying chicken. She discovered the art of doing this thing in the way that others could not, and she made a good living selling her exceptionally prepared chicken and fried puffs at the windows of the cars when the train stopped at the station. Well-to-do men and women of both races would leave the Pullman train with its modern diner attached and go out and supply themselves and their friends with this old lady's tastefully made-up lunches. Another woman of color, living in Columbia, Missouri, recently gave the world another new idea. She had learned cooking, especially baking, but saw no exceptional opportunity in the usual application of the trade. After studying her situation and the environment in which she had to live, she hit upon the scheme of popularizing her savorous sweet potato biscuits, beaten whiter than all others by an invention of her own, and the people of both races made a well-beaten path to her home to enjoy these delicious biscuits. In this way, she has made herself and her relatives independent. This is the way fortunes are made. But Negroes who are conscientiously doing their best to rise in the economic sphere do not follow the noble examples of those who had less opportunity than we have today. We spend much time in slavish imitation, but our white friends strike out along new lines. Almost all of the large fortunes in America have been made in this way. John D. Rockefeller did not set out in life to imitate Vanderbilt. Rockefeller saw his opportunity in developing the oil industry. Carnegie had better sense than to imitate Rockefeller, for that task was already well done, and he consolidated the steel interests. Henry Ford knew better than to take up what Carnegie had exploited, for there appeared a still larger possibility for industrial achievement in giving the world the facility of cheap transportation in the low-priced car. While such guidance as the Negro needs will concern itself first with material things, however, it must not stop with these as ends in themselves. In the acquisition of these, we lay the foundation for the greater things of the spirit. A poor man properly directed can write a more beautiful poem than one who is surfeited. The man in the hovel composes a more charming song than the one in the palace. The painter in the ghetto gets an inspiration for a more striking portrait than his landlord can appreciate. The ill-fed sculptor lives more abundantly than the millionaire who purchases the expression of his thought in marble and bronze. For the Negro, then, the door of opportunity is wide open. Let him prepare himself to enter this field where competition is no handicap. In such a sphere, he may learn to lead the world, while keeping pace with it in the development of the material things of life. Chapter 16. The new type of professional man required. Negroes should study for the professions for all sane reasons that members of another race should go into these lines of endeavor, and also on account of their particular call to serve the lowly of their race. In the case of the law, we should cease to make exceptions because of the possibilities for failure resulting from prejudice against the Negro lawyer and the lack of Negro business enterprises to require his services. Negroes must become like English gentlemen who study the law of the land, not because they intend to practice their profession, but because every gentleman should know the law. In the interpretation of the law by the courts, too, all the rights of the Negroes in this country are involved, and a larger number of us must qualify for this important service. We may have too many lawyers of the wrong kind, but we have not our share of the right kind. The Negro lawyer has tended to follow in the footsteps of the average white practitioner and has not developed the power which he could acquire if he knew more about the people whom he should serve and the problems they have to confront. These things are not law in themselves, but they determine largely whether or not the Negro will practice law and the success he will have in the profession. The failure to give attention to these things has often meant the downfall of many a Negro lawyer. There are, moreover, certain aspects of law to which the white man would hardly address himself, but to which the Negro should direct special attention. Of unusual importance to the Negro is the necessity for understanding the misrepresentations in criminal records of Negroes, and race distinctions in the laws of modern nations. These matters require a systematic study of the principles of law and legal procedure, and, in addition thereto, further study of legal problems as they meet the Negro lawyer in the life which he must live. This offers the Negro Law School an unusual opportunity. Because our lawyers do not give attention to these problems, they often fail in a crisis. They are interested in the race and want to defend its cause. The case, however, requires not only the unselfish spirit they sometimes manifest, but much more understanding of the legal principles involved. Nothing illustrates this better than the failure of one of our attorneys to measure up in the case brought up to the United States Supreme Court from Oklahoma to test the validity of the exclusion of Negroes from Pullman cars. The same criticism may be made of the segregation case of the District of Columbia brought before this highest tribunal by another Negro attorney. In both of these cases, the lawyers started wrong and therefore ended wrong. They lacked the knowledge to present their cases properly to the court. Our lawyers must learn that the judges are not attorneys themselves, for they have to decide on the merits of what is presented to them. It is not the business of the judges to amend their pleadings or decide their cases according to their good intentions. Certainly, such generosity cannot be expected from prejudiced courts, which are looking for every loophole possible to escape from a frank decision on the rights of Negroes guaranteed by the Constitution. These matters require advanced study and painstaking research, but our lawyers, as a rule, are not interested in this sort of mental exercise. The Negro medical schools have had a much better opportunity than the few Negro law schools which have functioned in the professional preparation of Negroes. On account of the racial contact required of white physicians who are sometimes unwilling to sustain this relation to Negroes, the Negro physicians and dentists have a better chance among their people than the Negro lawyers, and the demand for the services of the former assures a larger income than Negro lawyers are accustomed to earn. But in spite of this better opportunity, Negro medical institutions and their graduates have done little more than others to solve the peculiar problems confronting the Negro race. Too many Negroes go into medicine and dentistry merely for selfish purposes, hoping thereby to increase their income and spend it in joyous living. They have the ambition to own fine automobiles, to dress handsomely, and to figure conspicuously in society. The practice of these professions among poor Negroes yields these results. Why not be a physician or dentist then? Too many of our physicians are like the one whom the author recently visited in New York City. Quote unquote, "When I heard you coming up the stairs," said he, "I began to feel glad, for I was sure that you were another patient from whom I might extract at least $2 for a prescription." Yet one would wonder how that physician could prosper in his profession, for he had no special equipment for the practice of any kind of advanced phases of medicine. About all he could do was to look at the patient's tongue, feel his pulse, ask him a few questions, write a prescription, and collect the fee. The apparatus required for the modern treatment of serious maladies he did not have, and seemed to have no ambition to possess. The Negroes of today are very much in need of physicians who in their professional work will live up to what they are taught in school, and will build upon their foundation by both experience and further training. In his segregated position in the ghetto, the Negro health problem presents more difficulties than that of the whites who are otherwise circumstanced. The longevity of the Negro depends in part upon the supply of Negro physicians and nurses who will address themselves unselfishly to the solution of this particular problem. Since the Negroes are forced into undesirable situations and compelled to inhabit germ-infested districts, they cannot escape ultimate extermination if our physicians do not help them to work out a community health program which will provide for the Negroes some way to survive. Negro medical schools and their graduates must do more preaching of the necessity for improving conditions which determine health and eradicate disease. A large number of physicians and nurses must be trained, and new opportunities for them to practice must be found. This can be done by turning out better products from these schools and the extension of hospitals among Negroes who have been so long neglected. In this campaign, however, the Negro physicians must supply the leadership, and others must join with them in these efforts. From medical schools, too, we must have Negroes with a program of medical research. Today the world is inclined to give attention to the health of the Negro, since unsanitary conditions of the race will mean the loss of health among the whites. Philanthropists, however, hardly know how to proceed or which way to go, because they have so long neglected the Negroes that they do not know how to provide wisely for them. And the Negro physicians themselves have failed to give adequate attention to these conditions. Negro medical students have not directed sufficient attention to the antebellum background of the Negro who, still under that influence, indulges in superstitions and religious practices which impede the progress of medicine among them. One would be surprised to know the extent to which primitive medicine is practiced among American Negroes today. Often in the rural districts they seldom see a physician. The midwife and the herb doctor there control the situation. The greatest problem now awaiting solution is the investigation of the differential resistance of races to disease. What are the diseases of which Negroes are more susceptible than whites? What are the diseases of which the whites are more susceptible than Negroes? The Negro escapes yellow fever and influenza, but the white man dies. The white man withstands syphilis and tuberculosis fairly well, but the Negro afflicted with these maladies easily succumbs. These questions offer an inviting field of research for Negro medical students. While we hear much about medicine, law, and the like, their importance must not be unduly emphasized. Certainly, men should not crowd into these spheres to make money, but all professions among Negroes except those of teaching and preaching are undermanned. All Negroes in professions constitute less than 2.5% of those over 10 years of age who are gainfully employed. At the same time, the whites find certain of their professions overcrowded, and some of their practitioners could not exist without the patronage of Negroes. Negroes, too, should undergo systematic training for those professions in which they have shown special aptitude, as in the arts. They must not wait for the Americans to approve their plunging into unknown spheres. The world is not circumscribed by the United States, and the Negro must become a pioneer in making use of a larger portion of the universe. If the people here do not recognize the Negro in these spheres, let him seek a hearing in the liberal circles of Europe. If he has any art, Europeans will appreciate it and assure him success in forbidden fields. In Europe, it should be noted, the Negro artist is not wanted as a mere imitator. Europeans will recognize him in the role of an enlightened artist portraying the life of his people. As an English abolitionist said more than a century ago, quote, "The portrait of the Negro has seldom been drawn but by the pencil of his oppressor, and the Negro has sat for it in the distorted attitude of slavery." End quote. A new method of approach, however, is now possible. There has been an awakening in Europe to the realization of the significance of African culture, and circles there want to see that life depicted by the Negro who can view it from within. There is a philosophy in it that the world must understand. From its contemplation may come a new social program. Herein lies the opportunity of the Negro artist as a world reformer. Will he see it and live, or continue the mere imitation of others and die? Chapter 17. Higher Strivings in the Service of the Country. Another factor the Negro needs is a new figure in politics, one who will not concern himself so much with what others can do for him as with what he can do for himself. He will know sufficient about the system of government not to carry his trouble to the federal functionaries and thus confess himself a failure in the community in which he lives. He will know that his freedom from peonage and lynching will be determined by the extent that he can develop into a worthy citizen and impress himself upon his community. The new Negro in politics will not be so unwise as to join the ignorant delegations from conferences and conventions which stage annual pilgrimages to the White House to complain to the president because they have socially and economically failed to measure up to the demands of self-preservation. The new Negro in politics will understand clearly that in the final analysis, federal functionaries cannot do anything about these matters within the police powers of the states, and he will not put himself in the position of being received with coldness and treated with contempt as these ignorant misleaders of the Negro race have been from time immemorial. The new Negro in politics, then, will appeal to his own and to such friends of other races in his locality as believe in social justice. If he does something for himself, others will do more for him. The increasing vigor of the race, then, will not be frittered away in partisan strife in the interest of the oppressors of the race. It ought not to be possible for the political bosses to induce almost any Negro in the community to abandon his permanent employment to assist them in their ilk in carrying out some program for the selfish purposes of the ones engineering the scheme. It ought not to be possible for the politicians to distribute funds at the rate of $50 or $100 a head among the outstanding ministers and use them and their congregations in vicious partisan strife. It is most shameful that some ministers resort to religion as a camouflage to gain influence in the churches only to use such power for selfish political purpose. The Negro should endeavor to be a figure in politics, not a tool for the politicians. This higher role can be played not by parking all of the votes of a race on one side of the fence, as both blacks and whites have done in the South, but by independent action. The Negro should not censure the Republican Party for forgetting him, and he should not blame the Democratic Party for opposing him. Neither can the South blame anyone but itself for its isolation in national politics. Any people who will vote the same way for 3 generations without thereby obtaining results ought to be ignored and disenfranchised. As a minority element, the Negro should not knock at the door of any particular political party. He should appeal to the Negroes themselves, and from them should come harmony and concerted action for a new advance to that larger freedom of men. The Negro should use his vote rather than give it away to reward the dead for some favors done in the distant past. He should clamor not for the few offices earmarked as Negro jobs, but for the recognition of these despised persons as men according to the provision of the Constitution of the United States. The few state and national offices formerly set aside for Negroes have paled into insignificance when compared with the many highly lucrative positions now occupied by Negroes as a result of their development in other spheres. Sometimes a Negro prominent in education, business, or professional life can earn more in a few months than the most successful politician can earn in years. These political jobs, moreover, have diminished in recent years because the increase of race prejudice, which this policy has doubtless aided, supplies the political leaders with an excuse for not granting their Negro co-workers anything additional. The new Negro in politics must learn something that the old quote-unquote ward healers have never been able to realize, namely, not only that the few offices allotted Negroes are insignificant, but that even if the Negro received a proportionate share of the spoils, the race cannot hope to solve any serious problem by the changing fortunes of politics. Real politics, the science of government, is deeply rooted in the economic foundation of the social order. To figure greatly in politics, the Negro must be a great figure in politics. A class of people slightly lifted above poverty, therefore, can never have much influence in political circles. The Negro must develop character and worth to make him a desirable everywhere, so that he will not have to knock at the doors of political parties, but will have them thrown open to him. The new Negro in politics must not ask the party for money. He must not hire himself for a pittance to swing voters in line. He must contribute to the campaign of the party pleasing him, rather than draw upon it for an allowance to drive the wolf from the door during the 3 months of the political canvass. It will be considered a stroke of good fortune that a Negro of such influence and character has aligned himself with a party, and this fact will speak eloquently for the element to which he belongs. The new Negro in politics, moreover, must not be a politician. He must be a man. He must try to give the world something rather than extract something from it. The world, as he should see it, does not owe him anything, certainly not a political office, and he should not try solely to secure one, and thus waste valuable years which might be devoted to the development of something of an enduring value. If he goes into office, it should be as a sacrifice, because his valuable time is required elsewhere. If he is needed by his country in a civil position, he may respond to the call as a matter of duty, for his usefulness is otherwise assured. From such a Negro, then, we may expect sound advice, intelligent guidance, and constructive effort for the good of all elements of our population. When such Negroes go into office, you will not find them specializing in things which peculiarly concern the Negroes, offering merely anti-lynching bills and measures for pensioning the freedmen. The new Negro in politics will see his opportunity not in thus restricting himself, but in envisioning the whole social and economic order with his race as a part of it, and thus working for the benefit of all as prompted by his liberal-mindedness. The new Negro will do much more to bring the elements together for common good than he will be able to do in prating only of the ills of his particular corner and extending his hand for a douceur. In suggesting herein the rise of the new Negro in politics, the author does not have in mind the so-called radical Negroes who have read and misunderstood Karl Marx and his disciples and would solve the political as well as the economic problems of the race by an immediate application of these principles. History shows that although large numbers of people have actually tried to realize such pleasant dreams, they have in the final analysis come back to a social program based on competition. If no one is to enjoy the fruits of his exceptional labor any more than the individual who is not prepared to render such extraordinary service, not one of 1,000 will be sufficiently humanitarian to bestir himself to achieve much of importance, and force applied in this case to stimulate such action has always broken down. If the excited whites who are bringing to the Negroes such strange doctrines are insane enough to believe them, the Negroes themselves should learn to think before it is too late. History shows that it does not matter who is in power or what revolutionary forces take over the government. Those who have not learned to do for themselves and have to depend solely on others never obtain any more rights or privileges in the end than they had in the beginning. Even if the expected social upheaval comes, the Negro will be better prepared to take care of himself in the subsequent reconstruction if he develops the power to ascend to a position higher up after the radically democratic people will have recovered from their revelry in an impossible utopia. To say that the Negro cannot develop sufficiently in the business world to measure arms with present-day capitalists is to deny actual facts, refute history, and discredit the Negro as a capable competitor in the economic battle of life. No man knows what he can do until he tries. The Negro race has never tried to do very much for itself. The race has great possibilities. Properly awakened, the Negro can do the so-called impossible in the business world and thus help to govern rather than merely be governed. In the failure to see this, and the advocacy of the destruction of the whole economic order to right social wrong, we see again the tendency of the Negro to look to some force from without to do for him what he must learn to do for himself. The Negro needs to become radical, and the race will never amount to anything until it does become so. But this radicalism should come from within. The Negro will be very foolish to resort to extreme measures in behalf of foreign movements before he learns to suffer and die to right his own wrongs. There is no movement in the world working especially for the Negro. He must learn to do this for himself or be exterminated, just as the American Indian has faced his doom in the setting sun. Why should the Negro wait for someone from without to urge him to self-assertion when he sees himself robbed by his employer, defrauded by his merchant, and hushed up by government agents of injustice? Why wait for a spur to action when he finds his manhood insulted, his women outraged, and his fellow men lynched for amusement? The Negroes have always had sufficient reason for being radical, and it looks silly to see them taking up the cause of others who pretend that they are interested in the Negro when they merely mean to use the race as a means to an end. When the desired purpose of these so-called friendly groups will have been served, they will have no further use for the Negro and will drop him just as the Republican machine has done. The radicals bring forward, too, the argument that the Negro, being a minority group, will always be overpowered by others. From the point of view of the selfish elements, this may be true, and certainly it has worked thus for some time. But things do not always turn out according to mathematical calculations. In fact, the significant developments in history have never been thus determined. Only the temporary and the trivial can be thus forecast. The human factor is always difficult for the materialist to evaluate, and the prophecies of the alarmist are often upset. Why should we expect less in the case of the Negro? Chapter 18. The Study of the Negro. The facts drawn from an experience of more than 20 years enable us to make certain deductions with respect to the study of the Negro. Only one Negro out of every 10,000 is interested in the effort to set forth what his race has thought and felt and attempted and accomplished, that it may not become a negligible factor in the thought of the world. By traditions and education, however, the large majority of Negroes have become interested in the history and status of other races, and they spend millions annually to promote such knowledge. Along with this sum, of course, should be considered the large amount paid for devices in trying not to be Negroes. The chief reason why so many give such a little attention to the background of the Negro is the belief that this study is unimportant. They consider as history only such deeds as those of Mussolini, who after building up an efficient war machine with the aid of other Europeans would now use it to murder unarmed and defenseless Africans who have restricted themselves exclusively to attending to their own business. If Mussolini succeeds in crushing Abyssinia, he will be recorded in quote-unquote history among the Caesars, and volumes written in praise of the conqueror will find their way to the homes and libraries of thousands of miseducated Negroes. The oppressor has always indoctrinated the weak with this interpretation of the crimes of the strong. The warlords have done good only accidentally or incidentally while seeking to do evil. The movements which have ameliorated the condition of humanity and stimulated progress have been inaugurated by men of thought in lifting their fellows out of drudgery unto ease and comfort, out of selfishness unto altruism. The Negro may well rejoice that his hands, unlike those of his oppressors, are not stained with so much blood extracted by brute force. Real history is not the record of the successes and disappointments, the vices, the follies, and the quarrels of those who engage in contention for power. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History is projected on the fact that there is nothing in the past of the Negro more shameful than what is found in the past of other races. The Negro is as human as the other members of the family of mankind. The Negro, like others, has been up at times, and at times he has been down. With the domestication of animals, the discovery of iron, the development of stringed instruments, an advancement in fine art, and the inauguration of trial by jury to his credit, the Negro stands just as high as others in contributing to the progress of the world. The oppressor, however, raises his voice to the contrary. He teaches the Negro that he has no worthwhile past, that his race has done nothing significant since the beginning of time, and that there is no evidence that he will ever achieve anything great. The education of the Negro then must be carefully directed, lest the race may waste time trying to do the impossible. Lead the Negro to believe this and thus control his thinking. If you can thereby determine what he will think, you will not need to worry about what he will do. You will not have to tell him to go to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. If you teach the Negro that he has accomplished as much good as any other race, he will aspire to equality and justice without regard to race. Such an effort would upset the program of the oppressor in Africa and America. Play up before the Negro, then, his crimes and shortcoming. Let him learn to admire the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton. Lead the Negro to detest the man of African blood, to hate himself. The oppressor then may conquer, exploit, oppress, and even annihilate the Negro by segregation without fear or trembling. With the truth hidden, there will be little expression of thought to the contrary. The American Negro has taken over an abundance of information which others have made accessible to the oppressed, but he has not yet learned to think and plan for himself as others do for themselves. Well might this race be referred to as the most docile and tractable people on earth. This merely means that when the oppressors once start the large majority of the race in the direction of serving the purposes of their traducers, the task becomes so easy in the years following that they have little trouble with the masses thus controlled. It is a most satisfactory system, and it has become so popular that European nations of foresight are sending some of their brightest minds to the United States to observe the Negro in quote-unquote in action, in order to learn how to deal likewise with Negroes in their colonies. What the Negro in America has become satisfied with will be accepted as the measure of what should be allotted him elsewhere. Certain Europeans consider the quote solution of the race problem in the United States one of our great achievements. The miseducated Negro joins the opposition with the objection that the study of the Negro keeps alive questions which should be forgotten. The Negro should cease to remember that he was once held a slave, that he has been oppressed, and even that he is a Negro. The traducer, however, keeps before the public such aspects of this history as will justify the present oppression of the race. It would seem then that the Negro should emphasize at the same time the favorable aspects to justify action in his behalf. One cannot blame the Negro for not desiring to be reminded of being the sort of creature that the oppressor has represented the Negro to be. But this very attitude shows ignorance of the past and a slavish dependence upon the enemy to serve those whom he would destroy. The Negro can be made proud of his past only by approaching it scientifically himself and giving his own story to the world. What others have written about the Negro during the last 3 centuries has been mainly for the purpose of bringing him where he is today and holding him there. The method employed by the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, however, is not spectacular propaganda or fire-eating agitation. Nothing can be accomplished in such fashion. Quote-unquote, whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. The Negro, whether in Africa or America, must be directed toward a serious examination of the fundamentals of education, religion, literature, and philosophy as they have been expounded to him. He must be sufficiently enlightened to determine for himself whether these forces have come into his life to bless him or to bless his oppressor. After learning the facts in the case, the Negro must develop the power of execution to deal with these matters as do people of vision. Problems of great importance cannot be worked out in a day. Questions of great moment must be met with far-reaching plans. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History is teaching the Negro to exercise foresight rather than hindsight. Liberia must not wait until she is offered to Germany before realizing that she has few friends in Europe. Abyssinia must not wait until she is invaded by Italy before she prepares for self-defense. A scientific study of the past of modern nations would show these selfish tendencies as inevitable results from their policies in dealing with those whom they have professed to elevate. For example, much of Africa has been conquered and subjugated to save souls. How expensive has been the Negro's salvation? One of the strong arguments for slavery was that it brought the Negro into the light of salvation. And yet, the Negro today is all but lost. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, however, has no special brand for the solution of the race problem except to learn to think. No general program of uplift for the Negroes in all parts of the world will be any more successful than such a procedure would be in the case of members of other races under different circumstances. What will help a Negro in Alabama may prove harmful to one in Maine. The African Negro may find his progress retarded by applying quote-unquote methods used for the elevation of the Negro in America. A thinking man, however, learns to deal wisely with conditions as he finds them rather than to take orders from someone who knows nothing about his status and cares less. At present, the Negro, both in Africa and America, is being turned first here and there experimentally by so-called friends who in the final analysis assist the Negro merely in remaining in the dark. In the furtherance of the program of taking up these matters dispassionately, the association had made available an outline for the systematic study of the Negro as he has touched the life of others and as others have functioned in their relation to him. The African Background Outlined, a handbook. This book is written from the point of view of history, literature, art, education, religion, and economic imperialism. In 17 chapters, as part 1 of the work, a brief summary of the past in Africa is presented, and courses on, quote, the Negro in Africa, the Negro in the European mind, the Negro in America, the Negro in literature, the Negro in art, the education of the Negro, the religious development of the Negro, and economic imperialism follow as part 2 with ample bibliographical comment for every heading and subhead of these outlines. This facilitates the task of clubs, young people's societies, and special classes organized where the oppressors of the race and the Negroes cooperating with them are determined that the history and status of the Negro shall not be made a part of the curricula. In this outline, there is no animus, nothing to engender race hate. The association does not bring out such publications. The aim of this organization is to set forth facts in scientific form, for facts, properly set forth, will tell their own story. No advantage can be gained by merely inflaming the Negro's mind against his traducers. In a manner they deserve to be congratulated for taking care of their own interests so well. The Negro needs to become angry with himself because he has not handled his own affairs wisely. In other words, the Negro must learn from others how to take care of himself in this trying ordeal. He must not remain content with taking over what others set aside for him and then come in the guise of friends to subject even that limited information to further misinterpretation. Appendix: Much Ado About a Name. A participant who recently attended an historical meeting described to take up the question as to what the race should be called: Africans, Negroes, colored people, or what? This is a matter of much concern to him because he hopes thereby to solve the race problem. If others will agree to call Negroes Nordics, he thinks, he will reach the desired end by taking a shortcut. This may sound all but insane, but there are a good many quote-unquote highly educated Negroes who believe that such can be accomplished by this shift in terminology, and they have spent time and energy in trying to effect a change. Many of this class suffer mentally because of the frequent use of quote-unquote offensive expressions in addressing Negroes. When dealing with them, then, one has to be very careful. For this reason, our friends in other races have to seek guidance in approaching us. For example, Lady Simon, the wife of Sir John Simon of the British Cabinet, has recently asked an American Negro what his people prefer to be called. And later in England, she took up the same matter with another member of this race. Being an advocate of freedom, she has written considerably to advance its cause. She would not like to use in her works, then, an expression which may hurt someone's feelings. Although a student of social problems, this learned woman cannot fathom this peculiar psychology. Americans, too, must confess the difficulty of understanding it, unless it is that the quote-unquote highly educated Negro mind tends to concern itself with trifles rather than with the great problems of life. We have known Negroes to ask for a separate YMCA or YWCA, a separate church or a separate school, and then object to calling the institution colored or Negro. These segregationists have compromised on principle, but they are unwilling to acknowledge their crime against justice. The name, they believe, will save them from the disgrace. It does not matter so much what the thing is called as what the thing is. The Negro will not cease to be what he is by calling him something else, but if he will struggle and make something of himself and contribute to modern culture, the world will learn to look upon him as an American rather than as one of an undeveloped element of the population. The word Negro or black is used in referring to this particular element because most persons of native African descent approach this color. The term does not imply that every Negro is black, and the word white does not mean that every white man is actually white. Negroes may be colored, but many Caucasians are scientifically classified as colored. We are not all Africans, moreover, because many of us were not born in Africa, and we are not all Afro-Americans because few of us are natives of Africa transplanted to America. There is nothing to be gained by running away from the name. The names of practically all races and nations at times have connoted insignificance and low social status. Angles and Saxons, once the slaves of Romans, experienced this, and even the name of the Greek for a while meant no more than this to the conquerors of the world. The people who bore these names, however, have made them grand and illustrious. The Negro must learn to do the same. It is strange, too, that while the Negro feels ashamed of his name, persons abroad do not usually think of it in this sense. One does find in Europe a number of West Indian and American Negroes of some Caucasian blood who do not want to be known as Negroes. As a rule, however, a European of African Negro blood feels proud of this racial heritage and delights to be referred to as such. The writer saw a striking case of this in London in the granddaughter of a Zulu chief. She is so far removed from the African type that one could easily mistake her for a Spaniard, and yet she thinks only for her African connection and gets her inspiration mainly from the story of her people beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The writer was agreeably surprised a few days later, too, when he met a prominent Parisian with the same attitude. He has produced several volumes in which he champions the cause of the Negro, because he has in his veins the same blood. A well-to-do European woman, the daughter of a Dutchman and an African mother, is similarly enthusiastic over her Negro blood. The first thing she mentioned in conversing with the writer was that black mother. This young woman expressed the regret that she did not have more of that color, that she too might say, as do members of certain tribes of Africa, quote, "I am black and comely. I am black and beautiful. I am beautifully black." These people surprise you when you think of the attitude of many American Negroes on this question. These race-conscious people can think, but it is seldom that the American Negro indulges in such an exercise. He has permitted other people to determine for him the attitude that he has toward his own people. This means the enslavement of his mind and eventually the enslavement of his body. Some Europeans rather regard the word Negro as romantic. Going now along the streets of Paris, one will see advertised such places as l'Élan Noir and the Café au Negre de Toulouse. In one of these cases, the writer was especially attracted by the Shop du Negre and took dinner there one day. The cuisine was excellent, the music rendered by the orchestra was charming, and a jolly crowd came to enjoy themselves. However, he was the only quote-unquote Negre there. Walking along a street in Geneva not long ago, the writer's attention was attracted to something of the sort, which is still more significant. It was a wholesale coffee house called, quote-unquote, "A la Casa del Uncle Tom." He entered and asked, "Why did you give this store such a name?" The proprietress laughed and explained that her grandfather, Francois Prudhomme, who had read Uncle Tom's Cabin and had been deeply impressed thereby, selected this name for the store when he established it in 1866. The value of color. Not long ago, the writer saw on a streetcar one of the prettiest women in the world. She was a perfectly black woman, becomingly dressed in suitable gray and modest adornments which harmonized with her color. She was naturally a commanding figure without any effort to please others, for her bearing was such that she would not fail to attract attention. He could not restrain himself from gazing at her, and, looking around to see whether others were similarly concerned, he found the whites in the car admiring her also, even to the point of commenting among themselves. This woman's common sense, manifested in knowing how to dress, had made her color an asset rather than a liability. The writer easily recalled then that tribe in Africa that feels unusually proud of being black. We are told that they are so anxious to be black that if they found one of the group with a tendency to depart the least from this color, they go to the heart of nature and extract it from its darkest dye and paint therewith the native's face, that he may continue perfectly black. Here in America, however, we are ashamed of being black. So many of us who are actually black powder our faces and make ourselves blue. In so doing, we become all but hideous by the slavish aping of those around us in keeping with our custom of imitation. We fail to take ourselves for what we are actually worth, and do not make the most of ourselves. We show lack of taste in the selection of our dress. We long for what others wear, whether it harmonizes with our color or not. They have given particular attention to design with respect to their race, and have written books to this effect. Thinking, however, that the Negro is not supposed to wear anything but what the poor may pick up, the artists have not thought seriously of him. Both teachers and students of nearby schools thus concerned then repeatedly appealed to us for help in the study of design with respect to the Negro, but we have nothing scientific to offer them. We have no staff of artists who can function in this sphere. To be able to supply this need requires the most painstaking effort to understand colors and color schemes. It is a very difficult task because of the variation of color within the race. Sometimes in one family of 10, you will hardly find 2 of the same shade. To dress them all alike may be economical, but the world thereby misses that much of beauty. The Negro mother, then, needs to be the real artist, and the schools now training the youth to be the parents of tomorrow should give as much attention to these things aesthetic as they do to language, literature, or mathematics. In neglecting to know himself better from this point of view, then, the Negro is making a costly mistake. He should be deeply concerned with the aesthetic possibilities of his situation. In this so-called Negro race, we have the prettiest people in the world, when they dress in harmony with the many shades and colors with which we are so richly endowed. Why do we go away from home to find what we already have on hand? Recently, one saw in Washington a demonstration of the value of color when the Masonic conclave staged a tremendous parade in this national city. The whites were attracted to the upstanding, outstanding Negroes, so becomingly bedecked in costumes of the Orient. This, however, was accidental. The color of the Negroes happened to be Oriental, and the colors of this order were originally worked out to suit the people of those parts. The dead white of the Caucasian does not harmonize with such garb. Why then should the Negro worry about what others wear? Carrying the imitation of others to an extreme today, we do not find ourselves far in advance of the oppressed antebellum Negroes who, unable to dress themselves, had to take whatever others threw at them. We make a most hideous spectacle then when we are on dress parade in our social atmosphere. So many of us clad in unbecoming colors often look like decorated pet horses turned loose for an hour or so of freedom. Appreciating the value of color, the artists in European cities are trying to change their hue to that of the colored people. They can understand how inexpressive the dead white is, and they are trying to make use of what we are seeking to conceal. The models in their shops are purposely colored to display to good effect the beautiful costumes which require color. Some of these Europeans frankly tell Negroes how they envy them for their color. One is not surprised, then, to find European cafes and hotels employing American or African Negroes to supply this color which the Europeans lack. Pictures of such black men are sometimes displayed to great effect. That of Josephine Baker adorns the windows of large stores in Paris. Here in America, too, we observe that art centers are likewise getting away from the dead white to enjoy the richness of color. The writer felt somewhat encouraged recently when he talked with a Washington lady who runs, quote, the Pandora, a unique establishment devoted to design. Upon inquiring about her progress in the effort to teach colored people how to wear what becomes them, she reported considerable success. Sometimes customers insist on purchasing unbecoming attire, but usually she has shown them the unwisdom of so doing, and most of them now take her advice. In this way, this enterprising woman is not only conducting a pioneer business, but she is rendering a social service. She has not had any special training in this work, but on her initiative, she is building upon what she has learned by studying the Negroes in her community. Others of us may do likewise if we try to help the Negro rather than exploit him. This is the end of The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson.